I always thought the worst part of losing someone would be the moment they stop breathing. But it turns out sometimes the hardest moment is the one just before, when they decide what truth they're taking with them and what truth they're leaving behind. Ava had been my best friend since we were 16. She was loud where I was careful, impulsive where I was methodical, the kind of person who walked into rooms like they already belonged to her. When she was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer at 38, none of us understood how something so aggressive could move through someone so alive. The last month of her life blurred into hospital corridors, muted lighting, and the constant hum of machines pretending they could bargain with time. My husband Michael came with me almost every evening. He and Ava had known each other nearly as long as we had been friends. I introduced them the year I met him, and over time they developed an easy familiarity that I used to feel proud of. I liked that the two most important people in my life got along. It made everything feel stable. On her final night, the air in the room felt heavier. Not dramatic, just certain. The nurses spoke more softly. Conversations paused more often. Ava looked smaller in the hospital bed than I had ever seen her, but her eyes were sharp, almost urgent. Michael stood near the window while I sat beside her holding her hand. She had barely spoken all afternoon, drifting in and out of sleep, but when she opened her eyes that evening she asked if Michael could step outside for a minute. He hesitated, just slightly, before nodding and leaving the room. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Ava tightened her grip on my hand and whispered that she needed to tell me something and that I had to promise not to interrupt until she finished. My heart started racing in a way that didn't belong in a hospital room. I told her she could tell me anything. She glanced at the door as if making sure it was really closed, and then said she had carried this for years, and she couldn't die without putting it down. Before she could continue, Michael stepped back into the room saying the nurse was finished checking her vitals. Ava's expression changed immediately. She looked at him with something that wasn't anger and wasn't affection either, something closer to resignation. She said it needs to be said now. Michael moved closer to the bed, confusion etched across his face. Ava turned to me again and whispered, "I need to tell you something about Michael." I felt his body stiffen beside us. My mind tried to prepare for every possibility but found none that fit the setting. She looked at him first and said, "I'm sorry." The word landed with weight. I asked what she meant, but she continued, her voice trembling but deliberate. 8 years ago, before your wedding, Michael and I crossed a line. The room narrowed. I heard the faint beeping of the monitor and the slow hiss of oxygen, but everything else faded. I asked what she meant by crossed a line, and she said, "One night, after your engagement party, when you left early because you felt sick, we stayed behind to clean up and we kissed. Just once." I turned to Michael instinctively, and he didn't deny it. His silence was confirmation. Ava said it was brief and stupid and fueled by emotions neither of them understood at the time. She said it stopped immediately and never happened again. I felt heat rise to my face even as my fingers went cold. I remembered that party. I remembered trusting them to lock up. I remembered Michael coming home later than expected and blaming traffic. I asked Michael quietly if it was true, and he nodded once, unable to meet my eyes. Ava squeezed my hand and said she ended it the next morning and made him promise never to tell me because she believed it would only cause pain without changing anything. She said she convinced herself that silence was protection. Protection. The word echoed in my ears like a distortion. Michael finally spoke, saying he wanted to tell me before the wedding but was terrified of losing me over a mistake that meant nothing. That phrase meant nothing landed harder than the confession itself. If it meant nothing, why did it require years of secrecy? Ava's breathing became uneven, but she pushed forward. She said, "There's more." Michael took a step closer, but she shook her head weakly. She said months after that night she found out she was pregnant. My mind fractured into stillness. I couldn't process the sentence at first. She said she miscarried before she ever told him, and that she chose to bury it completely because she didn't want to complicate my future. I looked at Michael, and the shock on his face looked genuine. He whispered what in a voice I had never heard from him before. Ava nodded faintly and said he never knew. She said she couldn't risk destroying 3 lives over something that ended almost as quickly as it began. The weight of that information pressed down on me in layers. Not just betrayal, but the ghost of a possibility that never existed in my awareness. I felt grief that didn't have a clear shape. Ava's eyes filled with tears, and she said she loved me more than she loved the mistake, and that she spent years trying to be the friend I deserved to make up for the moment she was. I wanted to respond, to ask more, to shout, to cry, but the nurse entered quietly and adjusted her medication, signaling the end of whatever strength she had left. Ava pulled my hand closer and whispered I couldn't leave without telling you. Then her eyes closed, and within minutes the room shifted from fragile to final. Michael reached for my hand, and I pulled away without thinking. I wasn't sure which loss hurt more in that moment, the friend I was about to bury or the version of my marriage that had just been rewritten. The machines continued their steady rhythm as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but I felt something fundamental tilt inside me. Ava's confession lingered in the air long after her breathing slowed. And as I stood there between grief and revelation, I realized this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of mine. Michael reached for my hand, and I pulled away without thinking, not because I wanted to punish him in that moment, but because my body reacted before my mind could organize what it was feeling. The nurse dimmed the lights slightly, and the doctor stepped in quietly, speaking in low tones about comfort and timing, but I barely registered the words. I was staring at Ava's face, memorizing the lines of it, knowing this was the last version of her I would ever see. Grief and betrayal braided together in a way that made it impossible to separate one from the other. Within an hour, she was gone, and the finality of that felt surreal, like the world should pause for something so enormous, but instead the hallway outside continued with its ordinary hospital rhythm. The days after the funeral passed in fragments. People brought casseroles. They hugged me for losing my best friend. They said she was brave. No one knew that alongside mourning her, I was also dissecting 8 years of marriage in my head. Michael didn't avoid me. He didn't deflect. He answered every question I asked, even when I asked the same one 3 different ways. Hopping inconsistency would reveal something more sinister. He said the kiss was brief and stopped by Ava herself. He said he hated himself for it immediately. He said he had planned to tell me before the wedding, but every time he tried, fear choked the words. He said once the wedding happened and life moved forward, confession felt less like honesty and more like destruction. I asked him why he didn't insist on telling me once he knew she was pregnant. He looked confused and said he didn't know about the pregnancy until the hospital. The shock on his face that night hadn't been performance. It had been real. That detail complicated everything. It meant Ava carried that weight alone. It meant Michael's guilt and her guilt were shaped differently. One carried secrecy about a moment. The other carried secrecy about a life that never fully formed. A week after the funeral, I found myself replaying the engagement party in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. I remembered how close they had stood in the kitchen while washing dishes. I remembered how Michael seemed distracted afterward. At the time, I assumed it was stress about finances and wedding planning. Now those memories felt altered but not entirely corrupted. That was the hardest part. There were no other red flags, no hidden messages, no late-night disappearances. No gradual emotional distancing during our marriage. For 8 years after that mistake, Michael had been present, loyal, consistent. He came home every night. He supported my career. He held my hand during my father's surgery. If betrayal had been ongoing, anger would have been clean and decisive, but this was not ongoing. This was a fracture sealed under years of apparent fidelity. One evening, sitting across from him at our kitchen table, I asked him something I hadn't asked yet. If Ava hadn't confessed, would you ever have told me? He didn't rush his answer. He said probably not. The honesty of that hurt more than a lie would have. He said he convinced himself that because it never happened again, because he chose me every day afterward, bringing it up would only reopen something dead. He thought silence was mercy. I told him silence is control. It removes my right to decide what I would have done with the truth. He didn't argue. He just nodded and accepted that distinction. The real twist revealed itself slowly, not through drama but through reflection. As the weeks passed, I realized my anger toward Ava softened faster than my anger toward Michael. That surprised me. I expected the opposite, but Ava had faced death and chosen confession. She risked my hatred to avoid leaving me with illusion. Michael had faced life and chosen comfort. That difference mattered. One acted under finality. The other acted under fear of consequence. I asked him why he stayed after it happened, why he married me knowing he had crossed that line. He said because that night clarified something he didn't understand until it was almost too late. He said what he felt with Ava was intensity but not foundation. It was nostalgia mixed with proximity. What he felt with me was stability and depth. He said marrying me wasn't settling. It was choosing. I studied his face while he spoke and searched for defensiveness. There wasn't any. Just regret layered over time. Therapy followed, not because I was certain I wanted to save the marriage, but because I refused to make a permanent decision from a place of shock. In those sessions, something uncomfortable surfaced. The night of the engagement party hadn't been random. Michael admitted that during our engagement he felt overwhelmed by the permanence of it. Ava, being my closest friend, had become a sounding board for his anxiety. Emotional intimacy blurred into something charged. The kiss was a culmination of conversations that should have had boundaries. That insight didn't excuse it, but it made it human instead of monstrous. Months passed. The raw edge of the confession dulled into something reflective. I visited Ava's grave alone one afternoon and spoke out loud in a way I never had when she was alive. I told her I hated what she did. I told her I missed her. I told her I understood that fear and love can coexist in messy ways. Standing there, I realized she had given me something painful but necessary. She removed the illusion before I built the rest of my life on it unknowingly. The choice now was mine, not preserved in ignorance. The final decision came quietly, not in confrontation but in observation. I watched Michael with me during grief. He didn't retreat. He didn't justify himself anymore. He sat in discomfort without trying to polish it. One night, as we lay in bed not touching but not distant either, he said he would understand if I left. He said loving me meant accepting that I might not want to rebuild. That was the first time since the confession that I felt something shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But possibility. I realized something then that was both simple and complicated. Betrayal can exist in two forms: the ongoing, corrosive kind that erodes trust daily, and the singular, shameful fracture that is followed by years of consistent choice. We had the second, not the first. That distinction didn't erase pain, but it changed its shape. When I think back to that hospital room, I no longer hear only the confession. I hear urgency. Ava didn't want me living inside a marriage built on incomplete truth. She gave me the right to choose with full knowledge. And I chose to stay, not because the betrayal was small, but because the years that followed it were real. Staying did not mean forgetting. It meant restructuring honesty from the ground up. Michael and I still talk about that night. We talk about boundaries, about fear, about the danger of emotional intimacy without transparency. We talk about the child that never existed in our awareness and what that silence cost Ava. The marriage we have now is less innocent but more intentional, less idealized but more examined. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Ava had taken that secret to her grave. Our marriage would have remained untouched on the surface, but underneath, it would have been built on something incomplete. Her final act wasn't cruelty, it was correction. Losing her was devastating. Learning the truth was destabilizing. But living in truth, even uncomfortable truth, has its own kind of peace. And in the end, that was the gift hidden inside her final whisper.